Israel's parliament has passed legislation making the death penalty by hanging the default punishment for West Bank Palestinians convicted of murdering Israelis. The bill, long sought by Israel's far right, was opposed by both Israeli and Palestinian rights groups. Ken Roth is a former Human Rights Watch executive director and joins us now from New York City. Very good to have you with us, Ken.
Good to be with you, Russ.
So what's your view of this move by Israel's parliament?
Well, it's deeply disturbing on a number of grounds. I mean, first, the International Court of Justice ruled a year and a half ago that Israel's occupation is illegal. So Israel should not be entrenching the occupation by adopting new laws. It should be ending the occupation. But more to the point, I mean, as you note, this law is blatantly discriminatory. In the occupied territories, it basically only applies to Palestinians. It would not apply to Israeli settlers. Within the state of Israel, where a separate civil court system applies, the way it's been defined, it would essentially still only apply to a designated Palestinian terrorist, but not a Jewish extremist who committed the exact same crime, because it limits the death penalty to situations aimed at negating the state of Israel, which would presumably apply only to the Palestinian. And then the issue of procedure comes up because, the death penalty is obviously an extreme penalty. It should be used in rare cases. And if it is used, there should be the highest standards of due process. But this law does the opposite. If you look at the way it would be applied through the military court system in the occupied territories, it, for example, would rely on those courts that are notorious for convictions based on confessions from torture. There's a 96% conviction rate in those military courts. This is hardly the highest standards of due process. They then allow a court to impose the death penalty without even the judge requesting it, without requiring unanimity, where, for example, in the United States, which does retain the death penalty, you need a unanimous jury verdict. Here, it could just be a majority of the judges that are reviewing it. And then it doesn't really allow the discretion that is warranted in a case of a penalty this extreme. You want the judge, even if they're going to impose the death penalty in some cases, to be able to account for individual circumstances, to only use it for the most extreme cases. You want the individual to be able to seek pardon or commutation. But this law makes it virtually mandatory. There is very limited appeal. There is a rush to execution, presumptively within 90 days, maximum 180 days. All of this designed to, push through finality rather than insist on the highest standards of due process. So, for all of these reasons, this is a deeply disturbing, discriminatory law that, in essence, entrenches the apartheid that we've seen in the occupied territories, rather than moving toward some kind of fair justice system there.
The penalty is death by hanging, which is a very particular and brutal punishment. As someone who's worked for human rights for 30 years, what's your reaction to that?
Well, the reason they're resorting to hanging is that Israeli doctors refuse to do the lethal injections, the supposedly more humane alternative. And so that's why they are resorting to hanging. It's noteworthy that this law is very much a product of the far-right extremist Israeli National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And he's been, running around in these weeks before this vote with a noose on his lapel, kind of a pin of a noose. So he's taken pride in this. But it just really underscores the inhumane nature of the death penalty in all cases. And certainly it should not be applied with the discriminatory, unfair system that this new law imposes for these cases.
Are there any international legal levers which could be pulled to persuade Israel to repeal this law, Ken?
Well, what's interesting is that, so far, some of Israel's closest allies has objected. Not Trump, not the United States, where, there is the death penalty, but Britain, Germany, France, Italy, they all objected. UN human rights experts ran through a litany of problems with this law. So there is intense pressure on the Israeli government. I think the next procedural step is that this is going to be challenged before the Israeli Supreme Court. You may recall this is the court that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to undermine the independence of just before the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attack by Hamas. And there were huge demonstrations in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem opposing Netanyahu's plans. Those have been shelved, so the Supreme Court still retains its independence, but it's precisely because the court could overturn this law or at least modify it in significant ways. That's why Netanyahu has tried to subordinate it to the executive. Fortunately, he so far has not been able to do that.
And there's been no response from the US administration, has there?
No, and I don't expect one because, the U.S. has the death penalty. Trump is not going to object to what Netanyahu does. And of course, as we all know, the Netanyahu and Trump have launched a war of aggression in Iran. They've got their hands full at this moment.
Ken Roth, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.